So I've made a rule on my weekend song suggestion live streams that I do not take any more Avenged Sevenfold songs, and some people have misinterpreted that as me hating the band. It's just that I have nothing left to say about them. Once you've commented on over 20 songs across the entire catalog, you essentially get the gist of Avenged Sevenfold. They're extremely talented, they got a good sound, I've just run out of new things to say about them. That's partly what got me excited for this new release. When the new single Nobody came out, it sounded very different from what you would expect from them. It sounded like they were taking a lot of chances.
Just out of nowhere, randomly drops to just a cappella and almost like a quasi soul men's choir. I dig it. I'm 100% in on this version of Avenged Sevenfold. That's dope as hell.
I was equally worried because the production and mixing were pretty rough on that one, but I was just really hoping we would get some pretty cool, fresh ideas.
It seems like maybe they're trying to go for a lo-fi thing, but it just doesn't come across that way. This thing kind of sounds like a well-mixed demo to me overall than it does a finished product, like a mastered demo. I'm not sold on this sound design.
What I'm about to say in this review really gets me down because I really wanted to like this album. From everything I've seen and heard of Avenged Sevenfold, the guys are incredibly chill, they're extremely talented. I like that they're trying to stay on the cutting edge with blockchain. Specifically, M Shadow seems like the most chill guy in interviews, and multiple friends have told me who know him, he's a great guy.
Being involved in this business and seeing everybody treat what is supposed to be art, it's supposed to be an expression of who you are. It's supposed to be like, I want to know what's inside you. I want to know what you're feeling. And it becomes, what's radio playing these days? How do we get around the algorithm? And how do we like get more eyes on this? How do we get outside of our fan base and go wider? How do we sell, no one buys records anymore. How do we sell more merch? It becomes everything except the art. And then when you see a bunch of established bands that are totally cool with phoning it in or writing the same thing, and then we go in the studio and we like nauseous thinking about picking up a guitar and doing the same thing we've already done.
And I'm incredibly happy that Avenged Sevenfold are willing to take such risk with extremely bold choices on this record. You can hear the love, care, and effort put into this. It's there. I'm super happy the guys are trying to make something different. And the last thing I would want to do is discouraging them from taking risks or evolving their sound. I would much rather have this record than an album that is just more of the same we've come to expect. Having gone through that very long preface, this album sounds like a collection of some great ideas poorly stitched together with mediocre ideas. There are some great melodies, great chord progressions and voicings, and really fun, exciting drum parts. Almost all of them fall flat for multiple different reasons. At any point where there are positive moments happening, they are subverted by one or more of the following problems. One, the arrangements vary greatly in quality. The more experimental parts of the album seem to indicate to me that Avenged Sevenfold don't quite grasp what made the orthodox approach work in the first place. The more you better understand the rules on a deeper level, the more it informs how you can break them in an effective way. It's like they wanted to be absurd the same way that Sleepytime Gorilla Museum is absurd, and I think they just didn't have a grasp of what actually makes them great and why they can get away with such bizarre, outlandish decisions. Two, the production and mix are mediocre. I want to take an entirely dedicated section of this video to address this. There's a lot to address, but regularly when there were cool moments happening or a cool arrangement happening, the mix and the production subvert the ability to fully enjoy it. I think they needed stronger input from their producer and mixing engineer, hands down. Three, M Shadow's singing is very inconsistent. It had moments where he shined, but frequently it sounded like he was on the edge of losing breath control, and he had an alarming number of pitch problems. The way that he slides notes is reminiscent of how a nasally teenage girl would sing karaoke if she was singing Spice Girls. Four, there are far too many abrupt changes that are executed poorly. Abrupt changes can have an incredible effect, and they are risky to do. They used it as a tool of weirdness, but it happened so frequently that it really lost its gravity. When it's happened so many times on the same album, it loses its impact. Frankly, it just loses its impact. There were rare moments of elegance on the record. It felt very slapdash, ham-fisted, cobbled together. All right, let's specifically address the mixing and production. Given Andy Wallace is the mixing engineer and Joe Barresi is the producer, I am absolutely shocked this is the sound design we got. I'm truly mystified. They have some of the most important hard rock and metal albums under both of their belts. So these guys obviously know what they're doing. Some of those albums sound better than others, but I mean, at the end of the day, these guys are pros. These guys are legends almost. I do not have all of the information, just based upon what I heard and the personnel involved. My best guess, the band probably ruined the mix by insisting on certain revisions that don't serve the mix, or by insisting on poor source tones. Again, this is a complete assumption, but given what we're about to address, it's the one that makes the most sense to me. It's clear they wanted to make a large number of bold sonic choices, prominently featuring classic acoustic instruments, attempting new timbres with synthesis and effects, and messing around with panning. Most of these decisions ranged from mediocre to bad. On the single Nobody, I missed this before, but I'm pretty sure they panned the kick drum 15% to the left for no other reason other than it was different. It adds nothing to the experience. It doesn't speak to the greater narrative. It was just different, and it lost the impact in the center. The drum shells sound very rough, almost like they had a not very good capture, or they were oversaturating and embellishing the transients instead of doing it to the whole shell proper. The low end management between the bass and the kick made it hard to feel much warmth coming out of it other than just a generally bulbous low end, a bulbous sub. I wanted more prominent mid-range on both instruments. The guitars sounded as though the upper mids were pushed too hard. Combining this with an underrepresented mid-range in the bass, it rarely felt like the guitars and the bass were really glued together. No, this is not because of the arrangement choices. This is a noticeably unpleasant frequency gap between the two instruments. Any brass instruments had way too much saturation going on, especially in the overtones. It was like he used odd order harmonic saturation on the wrong instruments, and that would constantly fight with the distortion of the guitars. Any of the other orchestral instruments were mixed pretty dry. There wasn't a ton of character to them. The mixing choices for most of the Daft Punk or art rock parts of the album really crowded the mix more than it did make it feel larger and more exciting. There were regular masking issues when these elements were introduced. The mixing and production are hands down the harshest critique part I have of the album. Now let's go back to pacing. The overall pacing of the album was decent. There were some parts that felt like they dragged a bit. I'm not opposed to having elongated instrumental sections or parts that repeat multiple times. But these long repetitions or instrumental ventures really depend upon the timbres being great to listen to and inspiring. I didn't really get that from these sections. Again, going back to mixing and production. The ending of Opeth's Heir Apparent works because they arrange it really smartly, for one. But for two, the mix and tones are dialed in precisely. Incredibly well balanced and huge, like a massive blanket of sorrow you want to wrap yourself in for eternity. There were several moments where it's clear Avenged Sevenfold wanted that kind of feeling on their album, and from an arrangement and composition perspective, those could have worked. But the sound design and management made it more fatiguing than entrancing. The final 4 tracks, or the last third of the album, is where the album finally hits its stride for me. It's not a great place to hit your stride, but it's better than not having any feeling. While not all the ideas are perfectly tied together, I'm thinking specifically G, where they kind of go jazz fusion, and there's some really cool ideas that was like so close to being amazing, but it was the first moment where I really started to feel something. And while the segues between those tracks were somewhat abrupt, maybe a little jarring, I think those were the best transitions on the album. Even though I include the 4th track as part of the high point for me, it does feel a little bit like filler on the album. It was teetering on having a proper melancholy theme to tie the whole large messed up idea together, and it just kind of felt like it got lost meandering too far up its own ass. In a way, it's a perfect closer for the album because it recaps the overarching theme of meandering up your ass way too often. Which brings me to my next point, experimentation. This album really did feel like it was pretty far up its own ass, while being punctuated by ineffectual appropriations by other artists such as Daft Punk or Alice in Chains. Literally, what is it, Beautiful Morning? The song Beautiful Morning in its verses sounds like a direct ripoff of Them Bones by Alice in Chains. Conceptually, I love the idea of Avenged Sevenfold evolving past their Murica metal sound they've developed over the last 2 decades. And I really want to encourage them to continue to refine this level of experimentation they've reached for. There's something good here. This is not the first time Avenged Sevenfold has ventured outside of their formula, and on every album, it seems like they've challenged themselves in different ways. This is by far the furthest they've gone away from that. It makes me sad this wasn't more of a success because it seems like they had quite a few compelling, unorthodox ideas that they just didn't quite know how to put together. It makes the overall experience jarring and awkward. I've heard a lot of avant-garde rock and metal. I can't say I enjoy all of it, but I can usually acknowledge when it's really well crafted. It felt like Avenged Sevenfold were out of their depth, and this is where a really competent, well-rounded producer would fill those gaps. Looking at Joe Barasi's catalog, he definitely seems competent, so maybe he just wasn't well-rounded enough to take on something this ambitious and unfocused. I don't know. I'm trying to wrap my head around it. It's really mystifying. I can't quite get what happened here. I read in an article that this album was partially inspired by the writings of Albert Camus, an absurdist philosopher. Camus's writings contributed to the rise of absurdist philosophy. Maybe that's supposed to be the point, that there is no point. The album being so absurd and disjointed is an analog for man's search for meaning in a meaningless universe. The listener searching for meaning in inherently meaningless music is an allegory for that search. Is that what we're getting at? If it's all meaningless, then why the hell did you take it on in the first place? That's your paradox right there. You obviously found meaning in doing this. Is this Avenged Sevenfold's attempt at commentary art as opposed to art that makes you feel things? I feel something when I think about it, not when I just rawly experience it. That kind of shit can have its place, but it's mostly, again, way too far up its own ass. All in all, I have no desire to listen to this again. I could listen to it if someone really wants to. I can get down with it. It's not the worst thing. It's just not very good. The real frustration for me comes from knowing the personnel and talent pool they had involved with this, while it feeling like it missed so many fundamentals in pretty much every department except the guys playing the instruments. I actually want them to continue in this direction. I think if they refined this process and this mode of creativity more, they could make an unironic masterpiece. Even just looking back at the album, many of the pieces are there. I just don't like how the pieces are assembled. When Opeth first abandoned the metal side of what they were doing and going more traditional prog rock on the Heritage album, I was very disappointed. I still don't really care much for that album to this day, frankly, but they've refined that sound over 4 albums, and I think really hit the nail on the head with their last album, In Cow to Venom. With the right producer, and with them taking cues from the mixing engineer and producer, I bet they could smash the next album out of the park if they do this approach again. And I really want it. I want to hear Avenged Sevenfold keep reaching for weirder, crazier, harder shit. I really do. That inspires me as a musician. And again, I want to at least give them a certain level of respect and admiration for trying something so far outside of the box, especially when you know a certain number of your fan base just wants to hear heavy things go boom, go roar. A certain segment of them aren't really that interested in hearing anything different. I definitely want to acknowledge that. I just want something less stupid. But those are my thoughts. I would love to know your thoughts in the comments down below. Hopefully they do something that I like more next time. That'd be great. Anyway, I love you guys, and stay awesome.